Friends, very good to have you join us again as we seek to bring the word to life for the weekly gospel lectionary readings. And don't forget, there are three wonderful things you can do to help us as we try and help you, aren't there, James?
There are indeed. As ever, please do like our videos on
Thumbs up button.
YouTube. That'd be really helpful. And we'd love you to subscribe to the channel because then you'll get an email notification every time there's a new one coming out. And of course, the other thing is do share on social media, which or indeed any media that you like.
Yeah.
That would be great. That would be fantastic.
Type out the reference and send it in a letter to somebody. How about that?
That'd be nice
That's
and
old. That's
old-fashioned,
old school, isn't it? So,
isn't
there
it?
we go.
Just.
Now, James, we are in. Have I remembered this right? Trinity 17.
I think it is Trinity 17. Yes, I think it is.
Good. I hope I got that right.
I think the
If
numbers
not, I'll
they're
put a note at the
stacking
bottom
up
and do an
now, aren't
edit.
they?
Yeah,
They're
we are.
stacking up.
Yeah, we are. And we are in Luke's Gospel, are we not? And the tradition is I always ask you what the passage is.
Yeah, well, it's Luke 17, 11 to 19,
Mm.
and it's the story of the 10 lepers
Mm.
coming to Jesus while he's on the way to Jerusalem.
Mm. Now, there's lots of fascinating bits and bobs that are going to come out of this.
Mm.
Before we sort of dive into the detail, just one thing that has struck me, which is that, and this comes a little bit out of Joel Green's commentary, but it also just occurred to me as I was reading it, which is that um, this is a very sort of well-formed and shaped little, well,
Yeah,
pericope we would use. When we
yeah,
were doing theological essays, we always wrote pericope in our computers, early computers in those days, always changed it to periscope, of course.
yeah.
So, but this little pericope, which means a unit, it just occurred to me as I reread it, it's incredibly well formed.
Mm.
And in fact, that's going to introduce a theme about boundaries, which Joel Green points out that actually this
Mm.
passage is very well bounded. So we've got the geographical marker at the beginning, and then we've got the question to the Pharisees after it. So it's very well defined. Um, of course, this whole idea that these things are very nice and well formed did give rise to form critical ideas that the stories were sort of passed around the community before being written down, and that's why they've had their neat forms, which I don't think is at all persuasive. It seems to me that we can perfectly well explain this by the artistry of the gospel writer.
Yeah.
But what it just makes me realise that as we read these things, there is a way in which we can say, well, we know the story, we've heard about it. There are 10 lepers, which is a very convenient number. Interestingly, I didn't find any comments on that in the
No, no,
commentaries
nor
I
me.
read.
Mm.
And I suppose it's just a reminder that, I suppose it's like cracking open a nut. You've got a very well formed on thing on the outside, but you do need to actually break it open in order to get into the contents
Yeah.
and draw out some of the meaning.
Yeah, absolutely. The content's really important, isn't it? And I think, I mean, the other interesting thing about the way in which these pericopes are composed is the point that Richard Bauckham often makes, I think,
Mm.
especially in healing miracles, that probably the guardian of the story was the Samaritan, in this case, the leper who was healed. He would have told
Right.
that
Okay.
story over and over again, and
Yeah.
maybe that
Yeah.
was what the gospel writer picks up
Yeah.
and maybe does some shaping of their own. But
Yeah.
there probably was some shaping going on from the way that person
Yeah.
told
Yeah.
the story. And I think there's certain features in this story that you could well believe would be things that he would have wanted to remember. That particular leper would have wanted to remember.
Well, that's interesting you said that. I'm just going to slightly leap ahead because one of the three commentaries I read on this was by Robert Tannehill. And one
Mm.
of the things that the reason why I bought this is because people said Tannehill's very good on looking at issues around the narrative shape, and I found
Yeah.
that in this passage. And in fact, there's one little gem. Folks, do watch to the end because right at the very end, there's an absolute gem that I
Yeah.
discovered here. Which, in fact, James, you didn't spot, did you?
I didn't spot it. No, I don't have
Uh,
that commentary either. So
no, and it's a real gem. It's absolutely blown
yeah,
me away. So
yeah, yeah.
you'll have to watch to the end of the
No,
25 minutes,
it's a
folks, to get
beautiful
that. It is a
insight. Yeah,
beautiful little thing. It's
yeah,
finishing off
yeah,
the
yeah.
whole parable. But he comments that in terms of the form and the shape, that these healing miracles are often called pronouncement stories, where Jesus declares
Mm,
something
mm,
and something happens. And he says, actually, very often in Luke, these healing encounters are not don't take that pronouncement form where Jesus is the center. They take the form of a quest. And the
mm.
same is true, for example, of the story of the centurion and his servant in Luke 7,
Yes.
where it's not just Jesus, but the other character, the counterpoint, actually features strongly.
Yes.
And so we can see in this story, well, as we see all go along, the leper who comes back to thank Jesus actually features pretty strongly in the story.
Yes.
And actually, the shape of the story isn't just about what Jesus does and says, but it's also about the response of the individual, their quest to discover Jesus, and the fact that their quest is rewarded.
Yes, yeah. There's quite a lot of movement in this story, isn't there?
Yeah, there
Actually,
is.
and I think that fits with the quest idea that they come to Jesus, they keep their distance, that they're then sent by Jesus, and
Yeah,
then the one returns to Jesus. So there's
yeah,
quite a lot of movement. Yeah,
yeah, yeah. Well, should we dive into the
yeah,
text? And it is interesting. We did actually note last week that the travel motif, which was introduced by Luke in Luke 9:51, Jesus sets his face to Jerusalem. Actually, in the last couple of chapters, that kind of has disappeared a bit as
yeah,
Luke has been exploring issues around discipleship. But then now we're very abruptly introduced to it again, or reminded of it again. So in the introduction, on the way to Jerusalem, he was passing alongside Samaria and Galilee.
yeah.
And again, we have to sort of step in, don't we, to that context to realize there's a huge amount of freight just in
So
those three
much.
terms.
So much indeed, because I mean he's right on the borderlands between essentially Jewish territory and Samaritan territory, or and indeed in Galilee there's Gentiles around as well. So we're very much in a place where we don't know who he's going to encounter. We don't know the ethnic origin of who Jesus is going to encounter. There's no certainty about that at all. And so immediately Luke opens up this narrative, telling us something's going to happen here. Well, you don't know what it's going to be. And of course, that is exactly what happens. And he, of course, when he reveals, as he does, we'll get onto this no doubt in a while,
Yeah.
that the leper who returns is a Samaritan. That's actually at the top of the next column in my Bible. So it's really great because it kind of conveys it. It kind of absolutely articulates what Luke is doing in the narrative. But no, there's this huge ambiguity.
It's interesting just noticing that Luke defers the information there. And actually,
Yeah.
that's something we've seen more commonly in Mark's gospel, where Mark holds back a bit of information. And
Yeah.
here Luke's doing a mark on us. And he's holding
He
back
is.
a little bit of information to create that bit of narrative tension and surprise.
Yeah.
You go, oh, right, this one was a
Yeah.
Samaritan.
Yeah.
But there's also, interestingly, I think Joel Green brings out the fact that there's some implicit issues, big theological issues around the temple and about the
Yeah.
worship of God. And we see that made explicit in John 4, where, of course, Jesus confronts a Samaritan woman and says,
Yes.
we
Is it
worship
here
what
or
we Jews worship what we know. We worship in Jerusalem, whereas your worship is not legitimate.
Yeah.
And in Jesus' comments that he doesn't hold back. If that's for me, tell him I'm busy. Is that all right?
Yeah. No, that's never happened before, has it?
Never has. Where blah blah blah. He says, "Oh yeah, no, he doesn't hold back, does he?" In saying to the Samaritan, "Well, this one's you're a foreigner. It's the foreigner who's come back." So,
Yeah.
so it is interesting the boundary there. The fact the mention of Jerusalem, where the temple is, the fact that there's the enmity between the Samaritans and Jews in Galilee, although even Galilee was mixed, Galilee of the Gentiles. And of course, actually, earlier on in the narrative, it's the Samaritans who've rejected Jesus as
Yeah.
well. So
Yeah.
there's sort of added tension there as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. We really don't know what's going to happen. And yeah. Yeah.
Again, we've got a bit more sort of. Oh, again, when we were in theological college, we used to talk about liminality, didn't we?
Oh, liminal. Yes, everything's liminal. Yeah, so we're in the borderland, so everything's liminal. That means everything's up. Essentially, everything's up for grabs, and people can do unusual and unexpected things. I think that's what it means.
And he's as he was entering a village. So I think some English translations say he entered, which implies he's done so. Whereas I think actually we need to understand that he's approaching the village to enter it, because of course these
Yeah.
people would have been. They would have been on the margins, on the
on
outside themselves.
Absolutely, because so they're essentially socially outcast, and obviously the point that's often made about lepers is that it's not leprosy as we know it that they're suffering from, but a skin disease as prescribed in Leviticus, and all that happens when you've got something.
Whereabouts in Leviticus, James?
Is it around 12 or 13?
13 it is. Well done.
It's 13. Okay, that was close, wasn't it?
Don't remember the references. Yeah,
Always check my Levitical knowledge.
absolutely.
And so there is that. It's on the way in, isn't it? Essentially.
Yeah. And again, a little fascinating implicit insight into the whole question of identification and relationships and boundaries. So, although Jews and Samaritans were at odds with each other. Here you have a group who are on the margins of society. Again, all the commentators say the point about this so-called leprosy. I don't know why it's translated leprosy when
No, when it
it
doesn't
isn't.
really mean that in our terms. Odd, isn't it?
I think it's an interpretive tradition from the authorized version, which modern translators cannot shake off. The
Yeah,
Good News Bible talks about a dreaded skin disease.
yeah, which is much better. Yeah,
Credits to the GNB, hey?
yeah.
And but the fact that they are outcasts is overruled their differences, so that this
Yes, I was
group of
struck by that too. Yeah.
this group of lepers, this group of people who are outside, they're a mixed Jewish Samaritan group. It looks
Yes.
like.
So being essentially outcast or oppressed has brought people together from lots of different
Yeah,
backgrounds.
yeah.
Yeah, which is interesting because it's still, of course, that is what happens. Yeah.
Now we're beginning to get into some little intertextual echoes here, aren't we? Because there's an echo in earlier on in Luke, but there's also an echo from the earlier biblical narrative, the Old Testament narrative, isn't there?
Yeah, with that story of Naaman, and particularly, I think
I'm going to ask you what chapter that is.
oh,
Except the trouble is I can't remember. Isn't it 2 Kings? I want to say 2
yeah,
Kings
two Kings.
13. 2 Kings 15.
I think it's 15 actually. I think
Okay.
it's 15. Yeah.
Dear viewer, you can comment below and you can correct our
You
ignorance
can
if we've
you
got it
can
right.
check
So
us out on that one.
you can. 2 Kings 15, around there, yeah. Okay.
But what's particularly interesting in terms of the parallel with Naaman is that Naaman is sent to do something before he's healed. So I mean, of course, he objects to that, doesn't he? And so on. And here, the lepers are sent to do something before they're healed. It's not like Jesus just stands there, heals them, and then sends them to the priest.
Yeah.
It's as they go, they are healed, and it's as Naaman does as he's told.
Yeah.
Which of course
Under protest.
under protest.
Yeah.
That he is healed. So that's quite an interesting.
It's an interesting parallel, but also the whole setting is parallel as well because
Yeah.
the lepers have lifted up their voice, have cried out to Jesus because they're at a distance. And of course, I mean, one of the most insulting things in the Elisha Naaman thing is that Elisha doesn't even bother to go and see him; he just sends a messenger. So again, it's healing at a distance.
Yeah.
I was struck just reading this afresh how extraordinarily unfussy Jesus is. I mean, he doesn't even pronounce a word of healing. That's another reason why this isn't a pronouncement story.
No.
And this is, I find this again and again. This is absolutely characteristic of Jesus in the Gospels. Whereas, if you see your archetypal sort of charismatic Pentecostal healing event, where people make a great fuss and go, "In the name of the Lord, I pronounce you are healed," and there's a huge bit of sort of rhetorical and powerful ceremony. I mean, this is extraordinary that Jesus does nothing.
Yeah.
He doesn't wave his hand. He doesn't, and in fact, that's what Elisha said.
That's what Elisha.
Naaman
Yeah,
says to
Naaman,
Elisha, I'd hope you'd just come and wave your hand over me or something,
At least you
So
do something ritualistic, like
oh yeah, exactly,
apple
exactly.
or whatever. Yeah.
But I find it's extraordinary that Jesus never never turns healing into a circus performance.
No.
So number one, the power goes out for him to heal, as it were, almost effortlessly. Number one. Number two, the people who receive the healing aren't made a big fanfare of it. It's just, I mean, it's just extraordinarily low key.
Yeah, it is very low key, and I suppose one of the ways that works is that it becomes very personal, doesn't it? For that individual, it's not about a larger narrative than that, really. There is
It is relational, and again, we'll find that when we come to the end of the story.
Yeah, and I think today, sometimes as you talking about some of those kind of ways in which healing is done today, you do worry about the person who's being healed, and maybe they really don't want all that publicity around them, and very often that strikes me as entirely inappropriate, and so there's a kind of understanding and compassion from Jesus here, I think.
There's an interesting parallel, just to sort of go slightly off track a minute, because you and I offline have been having a conversation about hearing from God and sharing a word from God with people. Yeah. And I reflected on some of my experiences, and I think one of the things I realised is that when that has happened for me, and I've shared a word with somebody, it's been preceded by my being moved to love them and to listen to them before launching out and saying what I think God has said to me.
Yes.
and there's a double listening there, listening to the person and listening to what God
Yes.
has to say. And it seems to me the same thing here. And I suppose when I kind of complain and say to the Lord, well, I wish I had more words for people, or could pray for them and see healing more. And I think God's reply to me is, well, if you love them a bit more,
Yeah.
then that might happen more often.
Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
context here is always, for Jesus, is always love. The motivation is love. The motivation is never to make a fanfare and demonstrate the power of God for entertainment.
Yes, and of course there is that incident. I can't remember which is it with the ruler where Jesus looked at him and loved him.
Yeah, yeah.
Which
Mark 10,
is
the rich young ruler. Yeah,
yeah, which is exactly that, isn't it?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and that seems to be implied here with when he saw them. I think that phrase holds a great deal of Jesus' attitude to the lepers
There
in
is a
verse.
fantastic dynamic of seeing here in the whole narrative, isn't there? So
Yeah, there is.
I,
Yeah,
it's, I think it's implied that the lepers see Jesus at a distance, but then it's explicit. He sees
saw
them.
them. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And then the third bit is that the one who was healed sees
Or
that he
that he's
was
healed. Yeah,
healed.
yeah,
So
yeah.
there's and again, I think this is true all through Luke, that whenever there's a theme about seeing, it isn't just about setting your eyes on. It's
No,
actually about understanding and insight and
discernment,
realization.
isn't it? Yeah.
So this one in 10 has actually realized
Yes.
what this is. Not only he's not only just realized he's healed, he realizes what the meaning of this healing
Yes.
is.
There's always spiritual truth that comes through that, isn't
Yeah,
there? Yeah.
yeah.
Mm.
We've leapt a little bit ahead. One thing we've jumped
Yeah.
over is at the very beginning of the encounter, they cry out, they lift up their voice, saying, I'm looking at the
Yes,
ESV,
they
which has got
do.
this in it.
Yes. Jesus
But
Master. Yeah.
Jesus Master. And there are just two fascinating things about that.
Mm.
One is that there are very few people who call Jesus Jesus in Luke's
In
narrative.
Luke's Gospel. Yes. Yes. Extraordinary few. Yeah.
I think the only others are the blind beggar in Jericho
Yeah.
In
Yeah.
Luke 18 and the thief on the cross.
Cross. Yeah.
Jesus, remember me.
Remember me when you come into your
It's your
kingdom. Yeah.
kingdom.
Yeah. Yeah.
Of
And
course, I
Master.
suppose that there's a bit of narrative puzzle there because, of course, how do they
How do
know
you
the
know?
distance?
Yeah.
This is Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
It can only be reputation, surely, that the
yeah,
talk all around was
yeah,
of
yeah.
him. I suppose.
And by the way, he's also obviously come with an entourage in the sense that in verse 17, he clearly he's asking these rhetorical questions of somebody, and he must
Yeah.
be asking them. He can't be asking the man because he's mentioned him in the third person. So he must be talking to the disciples, and of course the disciples then come back in 1722. But fascinating at the beginning, on the way to Jerusalem, he was passing along, almost as if the disciples didn't count for anything. It's just
Yeah. Yeah.
focus is there on Jesus.
And I think we've noticed this before in Luke that they kind of appear and disappear from view, even though they're always in the background in the narrative.
Yeah.
So that's interesting.
But the other thing is that they call Jesus Master.
Yeah, yeah. And this is a term which is unique to Luke in the New Testament, isn't it?
It is actually.
He's the only person who used it. And interestingly, I think elsewhere in Luke, it's only the disciples who use the
It is.
title.
It's the Greek word epistates.
Epistates, yeah. And if people are slightly confused, I mean, um, in the Nunc Dimittis, it's often translated master, but it's a different word. So, so just to point that out. But yeah, so it's only here that it's non-disciples, as it were, who use it, and it seems to be associated with deeds of power, miraculous power.
Yeah.
So, that's master, we are perishing, or those kinds of
Yes.
things. So
It's actually derived from epi, above, and
yes,
istemi, just to
system.
stand. So it's one who stands above. So it's a person of high status. I suppose that it's particularly appropriate for Luke if, again, he's kind of, as it were, translating these accounts from a Jewish context into a
Greek
into a Gentile and a Greek context. So it's that Jesus should be recognized as a person of high status, not because of wealth or family, but because of his spiritual authority.
who he is. Yeah, yeah.
Well, it's also interesting that relates as well to the fact that Luke emphasizes way more than any other gospel the whole dynamic of power. So Jesus goes into the desert full of the Holy Spirit, but after the temptations, he comes back, and Luke says very specifically, he comes back in the power of the Holy Spirit. So it's really, really emphatic.
Yes.
That is fascinating, isn't it? I wonder then whether given the use of that term, whether the lepers, I mean, when they said have mercy on us, they could be just sort of asking for alms, but actually
I think they're anticipating something
happening.
more. I think that's certainly the way that it seems to be written, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. So here's another fascinating dynamic. Jesus, this is a mixed group, Samaritans amongst them. Again, this sort of implicit temple theme. Go and show yourselves to the priests.
Yeah. Which, of course, where they are that's very ambiguous, isn't it? I mean, is it Jerusalem, or is it Mount Gerizim, which is the Temple of the Samaritans, or which priests do we go to see?
Yeah.
But then, once again, fascinating is that question becomes irrelevant, doesn't it, with the return of the one who's healed,
Because they are healed anyway.
Yeah, and he never gets to the priest.
Yeah. No, that's true.
He comes to Jesus.
There's a fascinating differentiation of levels of faith here as well. Now, in our last week's episode, we had this question of increase our faith, and the word faith here isn't used. But again, the question in the next pericope, Jesus talks about faith. Will the Son of Man find faith when he returns? Yes. And actually, all these lepers have had to exercise faith in the sense that, having called Jesus epistates, having called him master, he gives them an instruction. And of course, they have to go first before they receive the healing. They have to set out. And again, there's the echo of Naaman again. They have to commit to the journey before they receive their healing. And yet, the one who comes back is the one whose faith has. Oh, we have an explicit mention of faith. Whose faith has saved him. So, so presumably, that's not true for the others who haven't come back. So on the one hand, they've had enough faith to receive healing. And there seems to me, again, to be something really fascinating here about the fact that Jesus is quite liberal in the demonstrations of his healing power.
Yes.
And then he leaves it to people to say, well, what are you going to do with that?
Yeah.
And I don't know whether there's an insight there for us for ministry, because sometimes I think it can be really frustrating, can't it, when you pray for somebody, or just one of the encounters that we were talking about, where I actually laid hands on someone and prayed for him, who's not a Christian at all. He was moved to tears, and yet, as yet, no evidence that that's led to a further response, further engagement.
I think I'd echo that. There seems to be faith to come to Jesus, and then there's almost the faith, the response, isn't it? It's the response of faith that actually is different for the Samaritan, and faith in its totality is both of those things. Yeah. Interesting.
So they go, and then the one sees he's healed. He turns back. Interestingly, Joel Green comments that there's no sense here that turning back is a sort of repentant journey. It's just as you said earlier, it's part of this journey motif, isn't it? It's movement. Yeah. There's a lot of movement. But here's the fascinating thing. He praises God with a loud voice, and he fell on his face at Jesus' feet, giving him thanks.
Yes.
There's something really interesting going on there in terms of Christology, isn't there?
I think there must be. I mean, what's really interesting is that in a sense, Jesus almost fulfills the role that the priest would have fulfilled if he'd actually got to the priest, but so much more than. So because the priest was where you sort of ratified your healing, but he wasn't the one who distributed it. No. Whereas here, Jesus is the one who both it sort of ratifies it, but also is the one who's actually given it, and that lifts Jesus way above. Well, really, both temples, doesn't he? I mean, but either the temple in Jerusalem or the temple in Mount Gerizim, I suppose.
Well, it's fascinating because you've got the whole emphasis here that the foreigner is included, and yet you've still got this repeated theme that we find in Luke that not only are the marginalised included, but actually so are pious Jews. So actually, the group of lepers who've been on the margins would have been their integration back in society would have been effected in the usual pious Jewish way by them going and showing themselves to the priest.
Yes.
And yet, as you say, Jesus transcends all of that.
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
So that the healing comes through, or the salvation comes through, coming back to him. So I think it's again, Joel Green makes this temple theme explicit. It hadn't really occurred to me before, but I can't help going back to the sort of intertextual echoes with John 4, where Jesus says to the woman, "I tell you the truth that those who worship God need to worship in spirit and truth. They won't worship either on Jerusalem or in Mount Gerizim." But so again, he's taking that tension and dissolving it and saying, well, actually that tension is resolved in me as the temple presence. So
yeah, absolutely.
And then again, we get parallels with the earlier account in Luke 5 of the leper who's healed. Although in this time, the leper falls on his face before Jesus in supplication in Luke 5, whereas here the leper falls on his face in thanksgiving.
Thanksgiving,
So
yeah.
there's a parallel, but with a twist.
Yes, yeah.
And then we get the big reveal.
The big moment, yeah.
Now,
And
this
he
one-
was, yeah.
This one was a Samaritan.
Yeah, which is really the pivotal point of the whole story, and the thing which would have rocked the sensibilities of the listeners or the
Well, certainly the sensibilities of the Jewish listeners,
absolutely,
the Jewish readers,
quite,
or those Gentile readers who've been set up to recognise the importance of Jerusalem and the temple, and all that sort of thing through the narrative.
Yeah.
And then I think we must infer that when Jesus answered, he doesn't answer. It looks as though it's a bit of a sort of an anakaluthon. It's a bit of a non sequitur in the sense that Jesus answered. Well, you'd think that he's answering the leper, but clearly he's not, because he's talking about the leper over there. So he's obviously turning to the disciples who haven't been mentioned yet.
Yes.
We're not 10 cleansed, where are the other 9? And that idea has sort of passed into sort of proverbial language, hasn't it, in English? People say that, where are the other 9?
Yeah. It has actually. Yes.
And again, this emphasis, he's the only one who returns and gives praise to God. Well, in principle, those who've gone to the temple are giving praise to God. But of course, again, it reinforces the fact that
It
actually,
once again raises the Christology, doesn't it?
There is a great, I'll read this great paragraph from Robert Tannehill. He says, why is it necessary to return and praise God? Presumably God could be praised elsewhere. Yet it is assumed in the story that praising God and thanking Jesus should go together. This scene, like in Luke 7, shows an interest in the bond of gratitude that can arise between Jesus and those who benefit from his work. It also suggests that the salvation the Samaritan has received is more than physical healing or an end to social isolation. It's a powerful experience of God whose saving power is present in Jesus. I think that's a brilliant little summary of the Christological shape of the narrative. So thank you very much, Robert Tannehill. Excellent.
Yeah.
Now this brings us finally to
the
my
moment, doesn't it?
a
Your big
little
moment.
bombshell at the end. I know listeners, viewers, you've all been waiting for this, or you might have just sort of scrolled through to get to the last few minutes. Fascinating. Here we go. Jesus says to him, "Rise and go your way. Your faith has saved you," or made you well. So the Greek verb can mean either thing. Your faith has saved you. And what I was blown away with, which again Tanner points out, is that phrase occurs 4 times in this gospel.
Yes.
Now, James, I'm going to test you now. Can you remember when Jesus says, "Your faith has saved you"?
Right. So there's the woman who has the issue of blood, I think.
Yes, that's right. Which is in Mark 5 and Luke 8. Yep.
Yep. There is. And I'm struggling now.
Go one chapter earlier.
The
woman who anoints.
Oh, the woman who anoints Jesus' feet. Yes, of course.
Absolutely.
That's right. So there's 2 women.
Yep.
And there's this Samaritan.
Yep.
And then I think there's a Jew as well.
It is. It's the. I'm pretty sure it's the one. The beggar.
The beggar by the side of the road.
Yeah. Yeah.
Your faith has made you well. Now that's really interesting. Go on, tell us what.
Well, isn't that fascinating?
That,
because it occurs 4 times, exactly the same phrase in Greek. 2 men and 2 women, and of the men, 1 Jew and 1 Samaritan. Now, the reason I was just blown away by that is it just suggests that Luke has composed his gospel so carefully, just to tell us, if we're in any doubt, that salvation in Jesus is for men and for women equally, and he's communicated that because we've noted all the way through that he talks these things in men and women, male, female pairs, exactly so, but also for Jews and Samaritans. So yes, indeed, salvation is from the Jews, John 4, but salvation is for everyone.
So it encompasses absolutely everybody.
Yeah. And of course that then reinforces all this stuff about the boundaries and Jesus being on the liminal spaces and so on.
There we go. No, lovely point.
What a great point to end on. So, James, thank you so much. Friends, thank you for joining us. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. And we really look forward to seeing you again next time. Take care. Thanks, James.
Thank you.